It was one of those perfect summer days in Lake Tahoe, the kind that feels almost too good to be true. The sun shimmered across the blue water, boats glided past each other, and families soaked in every minute of the weekend. Among them were Gary Spore and Wendy Wood, a well-known couple in their community. Successful real estate investors, grandparents, and the kind of people who seem to have built their own version of the American dream. That afternoon in June 2021, Gary and Wendy were out boating with their daughter Erin and their two young grandsons. It was the kind of day that felt simple and warm. Laughter echoing across the lake, kids splashing near the deck, Wendy passing out snacks while Gary manned the boat. They had no idea that this would be the last peaceful memory their family would ever share. When the sun began to dip, they steered back toward their stunning Lake Tahoe home, a multi-million-dollar property surrounded by towering pines. Inside, Gary took over the kitchen, cooking dinner for everyone, while Wendy and Erin chatted about the new indoor riding arena Erin had been dreaming of for her equestrian center. Before Erin packed up the boys for the drive back to Reno, Wendy handed her a check for $9,000, a gift to help make that dream a reality. They hugged, said their goodbyes, and Erin drove off with the kids. For Wendy and Gary, it was another perfect evening. The kind they'd lived for: family, love, stability. But as the night closed in, something was waiting for them inside that peaceful home. What no one knew was that hours earlier, a man had slipped quietly through the garage and hidden inside. He found a small closet under the stairs, dark, cramped, and close enough to hear every sound in the house. And there, he waited. For hours. He didn't break anything. He didn't take anything. He just sat in the shadows, listening, waiting for the perfect moment. When Wendy and Gary finally settled down in front of the TV later that night, they had no idea that danger was only a few feet away. Then, suddenly, the silence shattered. The intruder emerged, raised a weapon, and opened fire. Gary never stood a chance. Wendy was hit twice, but somehow, against all odds, she crawled to the bathroom and managed to dial 911. The dispatcher could barely understand her. Her breathing was faint, broken, but the call was traced to the house. First responders rushed in, finding her on the bathroom floor. She was airlifted to a hospital in Reno, where she clung to life in intensive care. For the next month, doctors fought to keep her alive, and somehow Wendy pulled through. But survival came with its own kind of suffering. Over the next 2 years, Wendy had to relearn everything: walking, speaking, reading, cooking, all while living with the deep emotional wounds left behind. She'd lost the love of her life, the partner she'd built everything with. Without Gary, the world felt empty. In 2023, overwhelmed by grief and depression, Wendy's story came to a heartbreaking end. But before she passed, she told friends and investigators something that would change the course of the investigation. She believed she knew exactly who had done this. And it wasn't a stranger. It was her own son-in-law, Daniel Serafini. Daniel wasn't just anyone. He was a former Major League Baseball pitcher, a first-round draft pick who had once stood on the mound under stadium lights. From 1996 to 2007, he played for teams like the Minnesota Twins, Chicago Cubs, San Diego Padres, and Pittsburgh Pirates. At one point, he even pitched in Japan after his MLB career hit a rough patch. On paper, Daniel had lived the dream. But by 2021, that dream had fallen apart. He'd been suspended for using a banned substance, gone through a messy divorce, lost a large portion of his earnings, and ended up running a bar in Nevada that appeared on the TV show Bar Rescue. The temper he showed on camera wasn't just for entertainment. It was real. Friends said Daniel could go from calm to furious in seconds, and when it came to his wife's parents, Wendy and Gary, that temper was explosive. Daniel met Erin in 2006 when she was just 19. At the time, he was 31, married, and already a father. Erin had been hired by his then-wife to help train their horses, and although the relationship started professionally, that would soon change. Years later, after his marriage ended, Daniel reconnected with Erin. She was studying to become a dental hygienist, but when he invited her to visit him in Reno, things moved quickly. Within a year, they were married on a beach in Hawaii, barefoot, carefree, and completely in love. But beneath the surface, their marriage wasn't what it seemed. They lived by their own rules, an open relationship that allowed for freedom and distance as long as neither one asked too many questions. Yet, when it came to Erin's parents, those boundaries didn't exist. Wendy and Gary were cautious, protective, and extremely wary of Daniel. From the beginning, tension simmered. When Erin dropped out of school to move in with Daniel, her parents were furious. They even threatened to sue him to recover the tuition they'd paid for her education. Wendy eventually demanded a post-nuptial agreement, one that would block Daniel from accessing the family's multi-million-dollar trust if he and Erin ever separated. Daniel signed it, but friends say it enraged him. Behind closed doors, he called his in-laws controlling, manipulative, even saying he'd pay money to see them gone. Erin had her own complicated feelings. She often told friends that her parents used their wealth to control her, deciding where she lived, how she spent money, and even what kind of life she should build. But no matter how strained the relationship became, financial ties kept them connected. Erin and Daniel leaned heavily on her parents for help: homes, cars, fertility treatments, even family vacations and country club memberships. It seemed like Wendy and Gary kept trying to help, even when it led to arguments. But generosity couldn't fix resentment. By 2021, Daniel's finances were crumbling. His bar had failed, his savings were gone, and he was working at a remote Nevada gold mine just to keep things afloat. He lived part-time in a trailer while Erin ran her equestrian business from their Reno home. To outsiders, they looked like a family still chasing the good life. But inside that family, the cracks were deep and growing wider every day. And then, just weeks before that tragic night in Lake Tahoe, Wendy wrote another check, this time for $70,000. So Gary could buy his dream car. No one knew that while the family celebrated, something far darker was brewing in the background. Because the masked figure who slipped into that house, the one who waited for hours in silence, wasn't just a random intruder. He knew that home. He knew their routines. And if Wendy was right, he was part of the family. The murders of Wendy Wood and Gary Spore sent shockwaves through Lake Tahoe, a quiet, picture-perfect place where violent crime was almost unheard of. The entire community was stunned. How could something like this happen here? There was no sign of a break-in, nothing stolen, no random fingerprints or forced entry, just a haunting piece of security footage, a masked man slipping into the garage hours before the attack, disappearing into the shadows. It looked personal, calculated, and detectives knew right away this wasn't the work of a stranger. They began with the people closest to the couple: family members, neighbors, friends. Everyone was questioned. The hope was that someone, anyone, might remember something that didn't feel right that night. But weeks turned into months, and every lead seemed to dry up. Meanwhile, Wendy fought to recover in the hospital. Despite the odds, she survived. But what she'd lost, her husband, her sense of safety, would never come back. She told friends that she believed she knew who had done it. She couldn't prove it, but in her heart, she was sure. Her own son-in-law, Daniel Serafini. It sounded unbelievable at first. A former professional athlete, a man who'd once pitched in front of thousands of fans. How could he possibly be behind something like this? But detectives had learned long ago that appearances mean nothing in a case like this. And as they dug deeper into Daniel's past, a troubling picture began to emerge. His once promising baseball career had crumbled after a suspension for performance-enhancing drugs. His bar in Nevada, the Bullpen, later renamed the Oak Tavern, had failed miserably, even after a televised makeover on Bar Rescue. What was supposed to be a comeback turned into a public meltdown. He'd been caught on camera lashing out at staff, cursing, and losing control. The same temper he showed there seemed to follow him everywhere. Emails recovered by investigators revealed a disturbing history of threats toward his in-laws. One message read, "Take the house. But if Gary ever talks to me like that again, I'll knock him out." Another, written years later, was even darker. "I'm going to kill them one day." At first, they seemed like angry outbursts, empty words. But now, in the aftermath of what happened in Lake Tahoe, those messages took on a horrifying new meaning. Still, without hard evidence, there wasn't much police could do. And as the case went cold, Daniel and Erin carried on with their lives. They still had financial support from her parents' estate. They still ran their equestrian business. Outwardly, it seemed like they were just another couple trying to move on from tragedy. But inside the family, things were falling apart. Erin's sister, Wendy, and Gary's other daughter, grew increasingly suspicious. She believed there was more to the story, and she wasn't afraid to say it. On the second anniversary of the killings, she held a press conference offering a $150,000 reward for information. It was emotional, heartfelt, and notably missing two people, Erin and Daniel. Not long after that, the sister filed a wrongful death lawsuit against both of them, claiming they were involved in the attack on their parents. It was an explosive accusation, one that reignited public interest in the case. And then, suddenly, something shifted. Investigators began re-examining old evidence. They pulled phone records, surveillance footage, and financial data. They wanted to know where Daniel and Erin were that night, who they spoke to, and whether anyone might have helped them. What they found didn't just raise eyebrows, it cracked the case wide open. Daniel's phone had gone completely dark on the day of the shooting. Normally, he sent dozens of messages every day. But that day, nothing. No calls, no texts, no pings. It was like he'd vanished, but another phone had stayed on. It belonged to Samantha Scott, Erin's friend, employee, and part-time nanny. A 35-year-old woman who'd been close to the family for years. She often helped watch the kids, handled chores around the property, and even joined Erin on trips. To most people, she was just part of their circle. But her phone told a story she couldn't hide. The data showed her traveling from Crescent Valley, where Daniel worked at a remote gold mine, to Reno, then crossing into California. From there, her phone pinged near Truckee, just outside Tahoe City. And that was the same area where Gary and Wendy lived. Around 6:42 p.m., a tan Subaru matching Samantha's was caught on a neighbor's security camera parked near the couple's home. Over the next few hours, it moved several times, as if waiting. Then, at 9:22 p.m., just minutes after the gunfire, it drove away. When detectives confronted Samantha, she stuck to her story at first. She said yes, she had spent the night before the murders with Daniel at a motel in Elko, Nevada. But she claimed that he left early the next morning to head back to his trailer, not to Lake Tahoe. Then, investigators showed her the phone data. The truth was harder to deny when they could map her exact movements across the state. Bit by bit, her story began to unravel. And when detectives dug up hotel footage from the Red Lion in Elko, they found something else. Samantha and Daniel together at the front desk, paying for a room with a hot tub, a room they shared. At that moment, everything changed. The so-called nanny wasn't just a family friend. She and Daniel had been having an affair. Detectives believed they had finally uncovered the connection between the shooter, the getaway driver, and the motive. According to prosecutors, Daniel was drowning financially, angry over his in-laws' control, and furious about the post-nuptial agreement that kept him from touching their fortune. He wanted their money, or at least the freedom it represented. And Samantha? She was caught in his orbit. Whether out of love, loyalty, or fear, she was willing to help. When police finally questioned her again, Samantha admitted that she had driven Daniel to Tahoe that day. But she swore she didn't know what he was planning. She said he told her he needed to pick up a package, and that she thought it was something harmless, maybe even drugs. But investigators didn't buy it. They had a witness who claimed Samantha saw Daniel test-fire a weapon earlier that same day. A weapon fitted with a makeshift silencer. That package story? It was falling apart fast, and now what began as a mysterious home invasion was unraveling into a web of lies, jealousy, and betrayal, one that stretched from the bright lights of Major League Baseball all the way to a quiet house by the lake. The pieces were coming together. But the next step, getting a confession, would prove even more twisted than anyone expected. Because when Samantha finally sat down in court, she wouldn't just expose Daniel, she'd expose herself. By the time the case went to trial in 2025, the story of Daniel Serafini had already gripped the nation. The former pro athlete, the family feud, the double tragedy. It was the kind of case that seemed almost too bizarre to be real. But the most shocking twist was still to come. And it would come from someone who had once stood by his side, Samantha Scott. The woman once trusted to care for Daniel and Aaron's children now sat in a courtroom, facing her own charges. She had already struck a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for telling the full truth, she'd avoid the harshest penalties. And when she took the stand, she didn't hold back. She began by telling the jury how she first met Daniel and Aaron back in 2017. At the time, she had signed up for horseback riding lessons at Aaron's ranch in Reno. The two women hit it off quickly. They became friends, then coworkers. Samantha started helping out more often, handling chores, babysitting, and even traveling with the family. That closeness, she said, eventually extended to Daniel. He was charming, easy to talk to, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had once lived under stadium lights. But beneath that polished exterior, Samantha said, was a man simmering with resentment. He felt controlled by his wealthy in-laws, mocked, undermined, and cut off from what he believed he deserved. At first, she dismissed it as talk, just frustration, but things changed in June 2021. That was when Daniel invited her to meet him at the Red Lion Hotel in Elko, Nevada, near the remote gold mine where he was working. They spent the night together. The next morning, he asked her for a favor, to drive him to Lake Tahoe. Samantha said she didn't ask many questions. She trusted him. She thought it was about a package he needed to pick up, something small, harmless. But as the drive went on, her nerves started to build. When they reached Tahoe, Daniel directed her to a quiet neighborhood lined with tall pine trees, a place where the air felt still and untouched. He told her to park down the street from a large home, then disappeared. Hours passed. Samantha sat there, waiting. She said she didn't hear gunfire, didn't know what he was doing. But when Daniel finally returned to the car, she knew something was wrong. His face was pale, his hands were shaking, and he carried a backpack. As they drove away, he began breaking apart a gun, tossing the pieces out the window one by one, along with his clothes and the backpack. By the time they crossed back into Nevada, there was no trace of what he'd used. For months, Samantha kept the secret. And then something unexpected happened. Their relationship deepened. She said that a few months after the attack, they became romantically involved. During that time, Daniel confided in her more, opening up about what he'd done. He told her he'd shot his mother-in-law and implied that he'd killed his father-in-law too. When Samantha expressed fear, she said Daniel warned her to keep quiet, or she'd end up just like them. But she didn't leave. Instead, she stayed in his orbit, still helping with the kids, still part of the family's daily life. Even after Wendy's death in 2023, she continued working for Aaron and Daniel as though nothing had happened. The jurors listened in silence as Samantha described those 2 years. The fear, the secrecy, and the bizarre double life she led. On one hand, she was Daniel's confidant and lover. On the other, she was Aaron's friend and employee. She even traveled to Mexico with Aaron in 2022 for cosmetic surgery, a trip paid for by Daniel himself. The prosecution used her testimony to paint a picture of manipulation and control, that Daniel had drawn Samantha in, using charm and intimidation to keep her loyal. But the defense saw it differently. They portrayed her as a woman scorned, someone trying to save herself by shifting blame. When it was Aaron's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent again. She looked composed, calm, but determined. She told the jury that her husband was innocent. According to her, the man in that surveillance video wasn't Daniel. She said she had seen the footage many times and that she knew her husband's movements, posture, and build, and that the person in the video was not him. Her loyalty never wavered. Even as prosecutors presented phone data, hotel footage, and Samantha's detailed testimony, Aaron stood by Daniel. She insisted that both of them were victims of a twisted lie, that Samantha had invented the entire story to protect herself. But the evidence was hard to ignore. The cell phone records, the timeline, the motel stay, it all lined up too perfectly. And when the closing arguments ended, the jury retired to deliberate. For 3 long days, they reviewed every detail, every image, every message. Then, on a warm afternoon in July 2025, the verdict was read aloud. Guilty. Daniel Serafini was convicted on all major counts, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, and burglary. The once-celebrated baseball player who had stood on the pitcher's mound before thousands would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. As the sentence was read, Aaron wept quietly, still holding on to the belief that the man she loved was innocent. Her sister, sitting across the courtroom, showed no emotion, just quiet relief that justice had finally been served. Samantha Scott, for her part, avoided a life sentence through her plea deal. She was convicted of being an accessory after the fact and would serve a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation. But in many ways, there were no winners here. A family was destroyed, a community scarred, and two young children left to grow up with the shadow of tragedy hanging over their names. For the residents of Lake Tahoe, the case became a haunting reminder that darkness can hide behind the most familiar faces. That sometimes, the real danger isn't a stranger breaking in from the outside, but someone already inside your circle. In the months after the trial, Erin's relationship with her only surviving family member, her sister, completely fractured. The two no longer spoke. The battle over their parents' estate continued in civil court. And Daniel? He'll never again see the bright lights of the ballpark. From pitching for the Chicago Cubs to hiding in a closet under the stairs. His story became a tragic fall from grace, fueled by greed, resentment, and the illusion of control. It's hard to imagine what Wendy and Gary must have thought in those final moments, welcoming their daughter and grandkids home after a day on the lake, only to walk into a nightmare they never saw coming. In the end, there were no hidden treasures, no stolen valuables, only lives shattered by choices that can never be undone. And as the courtroom emptied that day, one truth lingered in the air. Sometimes evil doesn't knock. It waits quietly, just beyond the door.